On one of my previous videos, I mentioned that porting your exhaust ports on a low performance build isn't really necessary, and I still stand by that. But there are improvements that you can make depending on the type of iron head you're contending with. If you see, you got these little plugs installed in the exhaust ports here. If memory serves me well, like in the 70s, I think California was the first to do emissions stuff with like the EGR. I believe that was for exhaust gas recirculation tubes. And what happened was, is there are these little metal tubes that were sticking down like into the exhaust port like this far. And I just beat those out with a hammer and put the plugs back in. But if you notice, you still have these large iron humps just sitting inside of the exhaust port, protruding outward. And that does create a restriction. So again, I'm not really gonna waste my time polishing exhaust ports. However, what I did with that same little die grinder that we talked about, the tungsten carbide, all I did was just grind them down a little bit and just get the surface halfway flat. So now you can see it's more of a square hole versus a weird elliptical, whatever the heck that is, the hump. So we went to before and then after. So you can see that's just a nice straight shot now to the exhaust port. So that is something you can do to squeeze out that 1 extra horsepower. Again, you know, things compound. You do 100 things that add 1 horsepower, you have 100 horsepower. And another thing that's really good to do, in my personal opinion, and I've done this to several V8s, I've never had a problem with it. But one of my biggest pet peeves on these V8 engines is what's called the intake manifold heater or the intake manifold stove. And that serves a purpose if you live in northern Alaska and there's 10 feet of snow on the ground. But in most cases, if you live where I live, where it's usually hot, that's just not necessary. So we're gonna flip the head over here. I'm gonna show you something. So you can see the green discoloration here, that's your antifreeze. So you never mess with these. You leave these alone. But this little guy right here in the middle, you'll actually see maybe some carbon buildup in there. I've started cleaning this out. This is the exhaust, this is the exhaust to intake manifold heater. And if you look way down in here, you'll see there's this gaping hole right here in the exhaust port. So right down in there, you'll see the holes. And that blows exhaust gas, boiling hot exhaust gas. And you see that oval hole there, and it blows it across the intake manifold right under your carburetor. So you can actually see on the intake manifold this large amount of corrosion. That's from all the heat. You flip this over, you'll see there it is again. You see all the carbon buildup? That's exhaust gases passing through your intake manifold, and just what'll happen is it gets this intake ridiculously hot, way too hot, and it'll boil all the gas out of your carburetor, and it causes stubborn hot starts, vapor lock, etc., etc. And I just prefer to block those off. Now, there's plenty of YouTube videos talking about how to weld cast iron. And for anything structural and durable, yes, you want to follow those rules. Use the high nickel iron rods. Use proper brazing techniques, all that good stuff. On this, we can cheat. If you have a half-decent flux core welder, you get you a little piece of plate metal. What you do is you cut it down to where it's just small enough to fit down inside this hole. You do want a map torch. Take that and you'll sit there and you'll preheat that iron, get it nice and hot, just the welds can penetrate a little bit. And you'll just set your plug down in there, recess it just enough to where the intake gasket isn't being interfered with. And you want to block off at least one, if not both of these. Now, I live down south where even in the winter, it really doesn't get much below 30 degrees. So having that heat system really is not necessary, especially in the summer. And that's something that's really easy to do. You can probably knock that out in a couple hours. But in doing so, it'll dramatically reduce the temperature of your intake manifold. Now, beforehand, you could actually pour water across this piece right here with the engine running. This would boil off. I did the same thing to my Buick engine. I can actually put my fingers right here with the engine running, and it's hot, but it won't burn my fingers. And the radiant heat off of everything in the engine bay will get this intake manifold warm enough to help vaporize the fuel. So again, it's just something that really isn't needed unless you just live in the coldest of climates. But if you ever do decide to convert to fuel injection, that'll only help you because you don't want a hot air intake if you're fuel injected. So there's a couple other little topics of conversation for today in regards to improving your stock iron cylinder heads for your budget build. Until we meet again, stay gold.